My ship does not fear the wind." Those were the last bone-chilling words of Pilot Luc before he steered the Le Griffon, a 45-ton fortress of oak and brass, straight into a Great Lakes hell. He ignored the shaman's hex. He mocked the tribal elders who saw the lake turn a ghostly, skeletal white. As the 7 thundering cannons faded into the mist, the largest vessel in the New World didn't just sink, it vanished into a supernatural void. For 350 years, sailors have sworn they've seen her, a phantom brigantine with tattered sails, gliding through the freezing fog of Lake Michigan, manned by 6 skeletons still clutching their gold-leafed furs. Was it a watery grave, a mutiny of blood, or is she trapped in a dimension between life and death? Today, we peel back the silt and the secrets. Stay with me until the very end, for what lies beneath the waves is far more terrifying than any ghost story. My dear friends, we talk a lot about the weirdness of the Great Lakes, specifically Lake Michigan. And today, we confront a phantom that has haunted these waters for 350 years. This isn't just a shipwreck story. This is the definitive mystery of the inland seas. This is the story of Le Griffon. To the world of maritime archaeology and treasure hunting, Le Griffon is not merely a vessel. It is the absolute Holy Grail. It holds the grim record of being the oldest unsolved ship mystery in the history of the Great Lakes. Many people errantly claim it was the first ship ever lost in these waters, but that isn't quite right. It was actually the second. The first ship lost also belonged to the same man we are about to discuss, Salle. But Le Griffon was the one that changed everything. It was the ship that never came home. Let's set the stage in 1679 and imagine the sheer audacity of René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle. In the history books, he is a French explorer, but in the reality of the 17th century, he was a high-stakes gambler, a man consumed by a singular, burning vision. He wasn't just looking for furs. He was looking for a northwest passage, a shortcut through the heart of a savage continent that would lead him to the riches of China and Japan. He dreamed of an empire that stretched from the freezing waters of the north to the tropical mouth of the Mississippi. But every empire needs a foundation, and for La Salle, that foundation was Le Griffon. It was the essential link. The heavy lifter intended to fund his future conquests by dominating the fur trade like no canoe ever could. But La Salle ran into a wall of water and stone, Niagara Falls. If you've ever stood at the edge of that abyss and heard the roar of the earth itself, you know that a canoe is a toy in its presence. La Salle realized that to conquer the upper Great Lakes, he couldn't stay at the bottom of the falls. He took his men, his supplies, and his iron will, and he climbed. He ascended to the top of the falls, settling near Cayuga Creek on the Niagara River. It was here, in late 1678, that he decided to build a ship that the wilderness had never seen. He wasn't just building a boat, he was building a statement of European defiance. Imagine the scene at Cayuga Island. The bite of the wind, the smell of fresh sawdust mixing with the scent of pine, and the rhythmic thud of axes against ancient trees. They were constructing a Titan. According to the journals of Father Louis Hennepin, this vessel was a monster of 45 to 60 tons. Modern researchers believe she was a 3-masted bark, stretching 30 to 40 feet in length and 10 to 15 feet in beam. She was designed to be a predator of the lakes. At her bow, they carved a magnificent griffin, the mythical creature from the family crest of Count Frontenac, with an eagle soaring proudly above it. But this wasn't just for show. This ship was a floating fortress, outfitted with 7 thundering cannons, 2 of them made of heavy brass. Salle knew he was an invader, and he intended for Le Griffon to be his protector. But as the wooden ribs of the ship rose from the mud, so did the shadows of the Iroquois. This was their land. This was their forest. They watched from the tree line, their eyes fixed on these strangers who were desecrating their woods to build a wooden house on the water. The tension was a living thing. The Iroquois were not just curious, they were furious. They saw the cannons, they saw the scale of the vessel, and they knew their way of life was under siege. Salle's men lived in a state of constant, vibrating fear. At night, they didn't dream. They watched. They slept with one hand on their muskets and the other on their swords, waiting for the war cry that could come at any second in the darkness of the New York wilderness. Then, the whispers began. It started as a rumor among the men and the tribes, but it soon became a dark cloud hanging over the shipyard. They said a shaman, a medicine man of the Iroquois, had looked upon the hull and placed a hex upon it. He cursed the wood, he cursed the iron, and he cursed the soul of the man who commanded it. The shaman claimed the ship would never sail the open sea, that it was born in blood and would end in silence. And as the winter of 1678 bled into 1679, the men began to believe it. This was a Midwestern winter, a brutal, unforgiving force that most of these Frenchmen had never experienced. The cold was so intense, it felt like a physical assault. Then, the wood began to scream. The green, fresh-cut lumber started to warp and crack under the freezing temperatures. The crew had to deconstruct parts of the ship they had just built, replacing warped boards in the middle of a blizzard. The men, shivering and starving, whispered to one another, "It's the curse. The shaman has poisoned the timber." Starvation began to claw at them. Supplies were running low. Salle, ever the stoic, had to leave his men behind under the command of Henri de Tonty, while he trekked back to Fort Frontenac on foot, a journey of hundreds of miles through ice and snow, just to secure more funding and fend off his creditors who were circling like vultures. While he was gone, the shipyard became a pressure cooker of mutiny and despair. The men were nearly broken. They were surrounded by a hostile forest, cursed by a local shaman, and led by a man who was halfway across the continent. Yet, against all logic, against the elements and against the curse, Le Griffon was completed. In the spring of 1679, as the ice finally groaned and shattered in the river, they prepared for launch. Tonty, fearing that the Iroquois would burn the ship before it could even taste the water, ordered an early launch. With a roar of those 7 cannons that sent the Iroquois into a state of absolute terror, Le Griffon slid into the Niagara River. The thunder of the gunpowder was the only language the tribes needed to understand. For a moment, the fear of the cannons outweighed the power of the curse. The flag of France was raised high. The Griffon, at the bow, looked out over the water, its wooden eyes fixed on the horizon. To the men standing on her deck, it felt like a victory over the spirits of the land. They had built a titan in a graveyard. But as they sailed toward the open waters of Lake Erie, the shaman's words echoed in the wind. Salle had his ship, he had his cannons, and he had his ambition. But as the sails caught the breeze for the first time, one question remained. Can you ever truly outrun a curse born in the shadows of the forest? On August 7th, 1679, the silence of the Niagara River was shattered. With the roar of its cannons and the snap of its pristine sails, the Griffon began its maiden voyage. Standing on the deck was Salle, a man who believed he had finally cheated fate. Beside him stood a crew of 32 to 34 men, a mixture of hardened sailors, frantic craftsmen, and the ever-watchful Father Louis Hennepin. As they glided into Lake Erie, they weren't just sailing across a body of water, they were cutting through a veil into the unknown. These were uncharted waters, territories that, until this very moment, had only felt the light, rhythmic dip of birch bark canoes. Now, they were being churned by 45 tons of European oak, a wooden titan claiming a world that did not want to be claimed. They navigated through Lake Erie, continuously sounding the depths as they passed through a moonless, fog-shrouded night, guided only by Salle's memory of a rough 10-year-old map. They moved into the Detroit River by August 10th, then onto Lake St. Clair, and finally into the vast, unpredictable heart of Lake Huron. It was here that the Great Lakes first showed their teeth. A storm so violent erupted on Lake Huron that even the most seasoned sailors fell to their knees in prayer. Father Hennepin recorded that Salle himself vowed to dedicate a chapel to St. Anthony if they survived. They did survive, but the lake had sent its first warning. You are a guest here, and your stay is at my mercy. By September 1679, they reached the islands of Green Bay, specifically what we know today as Washington Island. This was the peak of the mission. The island was populated by the friendly Potawatomi tribe and 15 fur traders Salle had sent ahead. Waiting for them was a king's ransom, 12,000 pounds of high-grade beaver furs, valued at a staggering 50 to 60,000 francs. In today's world, we're talking about a fortune that could build an empire. Salle saw his debts being paid. He saw his future secured. But it was here, at the very moment of his greatest triumph, that he made the decision that would haunt maritime history forever. On September 18th, 1679, a fateful parting took place. Salle, driven by a restless urge to reach the Mississippi, decided to continue his exploration by canoe with the majority of his men. He entrusted Le Griffon to a man known as Pilot Luc, a giant of a man with a reputation for stubbornness, and 5 other sailors. Their orders were simple: take the furs back to Niagara, discharge the cargo, and return as quickly as possible. As the sun began to dip, Le Griffon fired a single parting shot from its cannon, a final salute that echoed across the water. Salle watched from the shore as the white sails of his dream grew smaller and smaller on the horizon, eventually flickering out like a dying candle. He would never see his ship, his furs, or his men again. So, what happened to Le Griffon when it crossed the horizon on that gray September afternoon? 3 theories have been proposed as follows. The first, and perhaps most scientifically grounded scenario, is what I call the wrath of the Great Lakes. We must look at the primary accounts left by Father Louis Hennepin and Salle himself. They describe a catastrophic change in the atmosphere almost immediately after the parting. The Potawatomi elders, men who had lived by the moods of these waters for generations, saw the signs. They saw the way the birds fled inland. They saw the bruised purple hue of the clouds. They literally pleaded with Pilot Luc, begged him not to leave the safety of the harbor. They warned him of the great white storm, what we now call a white squall. This is a terrifying phenomenon where the wind whips the water into a blinding, bone-white froth, erasing the line between the sky and the lake. But Pilot Luc was a man consumed by a lethal European arrogance. He stood on that deck, looking down at the savage elders, and uttered the words that would become his epitaph: "My ship does not fear the wind." It was the ultimate act of hubris. Hennepin later wrote that the ship was barely a quarter mile from the shore when the lake struck back. The wind didn't just blow, it hammered. The natives standing on the beach watched in absolute horror as this 45-ton Titan was tossed like a child's toy. Imagine the scene: the crew scrambling, the sound of the oak groaning under the pressure, the 6 sailors realizing too late that their floating fortress was a coffin. Within minutes, the Le Griffon was swallowed by a white void of spray and foam. The theory suggests she was smashed against the jagged rocks of the Manitou Islands or driven into a shallow, shifting shoal. There, the sands of the lake bed, which act like a living, breathing desert, buried the ship, the cannons, and the men in a watery grave. It was a death born of pride. A captain who believed his technology was stronger than the spirit of the water found out, in his final terrifying moments, just how wrong he was. But if you find nature too impersonal, consider a darker, more human theory: the mutiny of greed. We must remember that Salle was not a well-loved man. He was a visionary, yes, but he was also a harsh taskmaster who drove his men to the brink of insanity. His crew was a powder keg of resentment, often on the verge of open rebellion. Salle himself, in his later, more cynical letters, began to suspect that the Le Griffon never sank at all, at least not because of a storm. Consider the cargo: 60,000 francs worth of high-grade beaver fur. In 1679, that wasn't just money, it was a king's ransom. To a lowly, exhausted sailor who had spent years shivering in the wilderness, that cargo represented a get-out-of-jail-free card. The theory suggests that Pilot Luc, the giant of a man with a stubborn heart, looked at those bundles of fur and saw a new life. He and his 5 men could have easily murdered any loyalists left on board. They could have sailed the ship to a hidden, desolate cove, offloaded the wealth, and then scuttled the vessel, deliberately sinking her to hide the evidence of their crime. This theory gained a chilling weight when Salle received a report from a young Pana Indian boy. The boy spoke of seeing a giant white man, a description that fit Pilot Luc perfectly, captured by tribes far to the south, near the Mississippi River. Think about the geography. If Luc was captured there, it means he abandoned the ship and tried to trek through the heart of the continent to reach the English territories where he could sell his stolen treasure. Did he trade the soul of the Le Griffon for a few weeks of desperate freedom? If this is true, the ship didn't die in a gale. She was murdered in cold blood by the very men sworn to protect her. The Holy Grail of the Great Lakes may not be a natural tragedy, but a crime scene of the highest order. Finally, we must confront the most violent possibility: the vengeance of the tribes. While the Potawatomis were allies, the Iroquois and the Ottawa saw the Le Griffon as an abomination. To them, this wooden house on the water was a demon, a violation of the Great Spirit's sanctity. There are unofficial Jesuit accounts, whispers from the missions, that speak of a night raid. Visualize this. The Le Griffon is anchored in a quiet, fog-shrouded bay. Pilot Luc and his 5 men feel safe behind their 7 thundering cannons, but cannons are useless against silence. Imagine 100 birch bark canoes moving like ghosts through the midnight mist, surrounding the ship without a single splash. The warriors would have boarded from all sides, a swarm of vengeance. The 6 sailors wouldn't have even had time to reach for their muskets before the steel and stone found them. To the tribes, the furs were merely spoils, but the ship was a threat that had to be erased. They would have stripped the vessel of every scrap of magic metal, taken what they wanted, and then set the wooden hull ablaze. The Le Griffon would have burned to the waterline, a pillar of fire in the dark, until nothing remained but charcoal and ash, sinking slowly into the freezing silt of the lake floor. Each of these 3 scenarios, the storm, the mutiny, the raid, is a doorway into a different kind of horror. Whether it was the arrogance of a pilot, the greed of a traitor, or the spear of a warrior, the result remains the same: a total, suffocating silence that has lasted for 345 years. The Le Griffon carried the weight of an empire, the wealth of a colony, and the staggering hubris of a man who thought he could own the Great Lakes. Instead, she became their most prized prisoner. As I stand before you today, I want you to feel the crushing weight of that silence. Put yourself in Lasalle's boots. Imagine him wading on the desolate shores of the St. Joseph River. Every morning he wakes up and scans the horizon, praying for the sight of a white sail. Every evening he watches the sun set over an empty lake. Day after day, month after month, the hope turns into a rot in his chest. He lost his fortune, he lost his pride, and eventually he would lose his life in the pursuit of the dream that Le Griffon represented. The search for the Le Griffon didn't begin in the age of satellites and underwater drones. It began in the raw, grief-stricken heart of the 17th century. Imagine Henry de Tonty, Lasalle's most loyal lieutenant, the man who had stood on the banks of Cayuga Creek and watched the ship's ribs being formed. In 1689, just a decade after the disappearance, Tonty went back into the vast, churning gray expanse of Lake Michigan. He wasn't looking for a treasure to put in a museum. He was looking for his friends. He was looking for the 6 men he had served with, men who had been swallowed by the great water without a trace. Tonty's expedition was the first documented attempt to solve the mystery, and its failure set a tragic tone for the next 300 years. If the man who knew every notch in that timber, every hand-forged bolt in that hull, couldn't find her when the wood was still fresh and the memories were still sharp, what hope did the rest of the world have? Since Tonty's first silent return in 1689, there have been at least 22 major documented claims of discovery. 22 times the world held its breath, and 22 times the Great Lakes sent back nothing but empty waves. Perhaps the most haunting and tantalizing chapter of this entire hunt occurred between 1873 and 1898 on the rugged, windswept western edge of Manitoulin Island. This is where the mystery stops being about maps and starts being about ghosts. Near a lighthouse at the Mississauga Strait, explorers stumbled upon a scene that looks like it was ripped straight from the pages of a Gothic tragedy. A limestone cave containing 6 skeletons. Think about that number. 6. The exact number of the crew Salle had sent back toward Niagara. Imagine the isolation of those men. Did they survive the wreck only to crawl into a dark stone womb to die of starvation? Beside these remains lay artifacts that spoke a silent French tongue. 17th century coins, a silver watch, and fragments of a wreckage that defied local explanation. When the timbers found near the cave were later analyzed, The evidence was staggering. They found lead caulking and iron bolts smelted with wood fuel, a technique specific to 17th century France. This wasn't just any shipwreck. It had the DNA of Lassalle's ambition written into its iron. But then, as if the shaman's curse was still actively protecting its prize, a series of unfortunate accidents occurred. The lighthouse that stored these priceless artifacts caught fire. The skeletons were lost. The silver watch vanished. The coins disappeared into ash or private collections. In 1942, a massive storm, as if acting on orders from the lake itself, swept the remaining timbers off the shore and back into the depths. The lake didn't just hide the ship, it reached onto the land and reclaimed the proof. In 2001, Steve and Kathy Libert, a couple who have dedicated over 30 years of their lives to this phantom, detected a 19-foot wooden timber protruding from the lakebed near Poverty Island. To them, this wasn't a piece of debris, it was the bowsprit, the very nose of the Griffon. They spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting a legal war against the state of Michigan just for the right to look. They were fueled by a passion that borders on religious fervor, believing they had finally located the Holy Grail. But when that timber was finally raised in 2013, under the watchful eyes of both French and American archaeologists, the dream hit a wall of cold, bureaucratic ice. State officials looked at this 19-foot artifact and didn't see a 17th century marvel. They called it a fishing stake, a common pole used by 19th century net fishers. The carbon dating results were the final insult. They came back with a range from 1660 to 1950. In scientific terms, that isn't a date, it's a shrug. It covers everything from Lassalle's voyage to the invention of the television. The Liberts didn't accept this. How could they? They had seen sonar images that showed an anomaly beneath the silt, a shape roughly 40 by 18 feet, the exact footprint of the Le Griffon. They began to suspect a government cover-up. Why is the state so eager to dismiss a potential world-class discovery? Why, out of the 1,500 identified shipwrecks in the Great Lakes, is this specific one treated with such hostility and secrecy? The suspicion grew. Was the government protecting a delicate historical site? Or were they protecting a secret buried in that silt that they didn't want the public to see? The Liberts even wrote a 160-page book to publicize their findings, a desperate attempt to keep the flame of discovery alive against a tide of official denial. The tragedy of the Le Griffon hunt is that it attracts the brave and the desperate. In 2014, Frederick Monroe and Kevin Dykstra made headlines by claiming they had found the ship, pointing to a figurehead on the bow that resembled a griffin's head. But once again, the state stepped in. Wayne Lusardi, the state's maritime archaeologist, dove on the site and delivered a crushing blow. It was a 90-foot tugboat with a steam boiler, not a 17th century sailing ship. The Griffon they saw was merely a trick of light and decay. We must ask ourselves, why does this ship continue to evade us? Why does every piece of evidence, from the Manitoulin skeletons to the Poverty Island mast, eventually turn to dust or doubt? There are 1,500 ships at the bottom of these lakes, and we know their names, their crews, and their final moments. But the Le Griffon, the one that started it all, remains a ghost. It is a holy grail that seems to possess a life of its own, guarded by a wall of silence from the authorities and a shroud of silt from the lakes. Now, my dear friends, forget the rotted timber and the broken bolts for a moment. Forget the lawsuits and the silt. I want you to look at the fog. Because for 350 years, sailors on Lake Michigan haven't just been searching for a wreck. They've been running away from a ghost. This is where our story stops being a history lesson and starts being a haunting. We are talking about a 45-ton phantom that refuses to stay dead. The sightings of Le Griffon are as consistent as the tides. From the 19th century lighthouse keepers to modern-day weekend boaters, the reports describe the same terrifying silhouette. A three-masted bark, its hull gray and weathered, gliding silently through the thickest Lake Michigan mist. It doesn't appear on radar. It doesn't make a sound. It just emerges, a perfect wooden time capsule from 1679, only to dissolve back into the gray void the moment you reach for your camera. Is it a mirage? Or is the lake playing back a recording of a tragedy so violent that the universe cannot let it go? This brings us to the chilling theory of the purgatory of the Hex. We must return to the Iroquois shaman's curse. The legend says the ship was sent to a place between, a realm that is neither our world nor the next. If Le Griffon is trapped in a temporal purgatory, it explains why 350 years of sonar have failed to find her bones. She exists in a constant loop, a spiritual portal that opens and closes at the whim of the lake's energy. To the 6 skeletons on board, are they still fighting that 1679 storm for eternity? Are we the ghosts to them, just as they are to us? And then, there is the most radical possibility, the Lake Erie abduction. Some theorists argue the Griffon didn't sink in Michigan, but was driven through the straits into Lake Erie, a body of water notorious for strange lights and unidentified submerged objects, USOs. Could one of the first European ships on these lakes have been collected by a force far more advanced than our own? Indigenous accounts from that era spoke of lights in the sky that didn't behave like stars. Was the Griffon snatched away before she could fulfill her destiny? As someone haunted by these shadows, I ask you, why does this ship continue to evade every satellite and diver? Perhaps it is not lying at the bottom of the lake. Perhaps it is still sailing, just beyond our reality, hidden behind a veil of mist. Even if Le Griffon only performed half of her journey, her impact was monumental. She proved the terrifying feasibility of commercializing the Great Lakes. She showed that a large-scale European vessel could navigate these inland seas, even if the price was her own soul. But the lakes sent a message so clear and so brutal that it took over 80 years before another sailing ship dared to return to these upper waters. For nearly a century, the Great Lakes belonged once again to the canoes and the spirits, as if the water itself was trying to digest the memory of the French invader. The problem of Le Griffon remains unsolved. She is the ultimate cold case. Is she a shattered wreckage at the bottom of Lake Michigan, hidden by silt and invasive mussels? Is she the 6 skeletons in the Manitoulin Cave, lost to fire and bureaucratic negligence? Or is she a spirit still wandering between dimensions, a ghost ship that will continue to sail as long as there is fog on the water? The intervention of modern governments, the denial of permits, and the dismissal of artifacts like the Poverty Island timber only add layers to the mystery. It makes us wonder, what is the secret? What is truly hidden down there that they don't want you to see? Is it a portal? Is it an alien base? Or is it simply the realization that we are not the masters of these lakes? The mystery of the Le Griffon isn't just about a lost ship. It's about the dark, unexplored heart of America. It's about the dreams of men like Salle being swallowed by a world that refuses to be tamed. Finally, thank you for embarking on this 350-year journey into the gray mist of 1679 with me. A special thank you to a viewer whose insightful comment became the ultimate spark and motivation for us to perfect this video, ensuring we deliver the most profound experience for you today. If you have your own stories, theories, or even a chilling encounter with the ghosts of the Great Lakes, please share them with us in the comments. Your voice keeps this legend alive. If this journey moved you, please like, share, and follow for our upcoming maritime explorations. Until we meet again in our next video, keep watching the fog. Goodbye for now.